Hey everybody, Nick here with JMZ Online. We're back working on the 350 Pontiac. Now we're getting the parts cleaned up and we're kind of doing our inspection and getting ready to go on the machine work.
I always magnaflux the heads first things after cleaning to make sure that the heads aren't cracked before we do any machine work. And then I'm moving right into doing the surfacing operations on the heads.
So here I'm working on putting our level, getting it tuned in so that we're dead nuts level before we start our resurface. I've got a support stand under there to kind of support the other side of the head.
In this case, we're removing just enough material to clean up and provide a good surface for the head gaskets to seal against, and usually this amounts to just a few thousandths of an inch depending on the quality of the surface to begin with.
Now I'm set up surfacing the exhaust side of this head. So at this point we've got the head mounted up on the TCM valve guide machine. We're going to go through, drill all of the guides out so that we can replace them, as well as cut down the top of the guide to accept our positive valve stem seal. So now we're going to be driving in our new exhaust guides. We're putting in a hardened cast iron guide, and one thing you want to do is be sure to use a good lubricant. So this is a press fit lubricant that I use. I'll go ahead and spray all the bores with a little bit of it. Now we're going to go through and we're going to trim the top of the guide down to make it match this head so that it'll accept a positive valve stem seal. From the factory, these heads did not have a valve stem seal. They only had the O-ring seal that goes between the valve spring retainer and the valve, as well as a shield on the valve spring that acts as kind of an umbrella to keep most of the oil off the seal. We're going to bring this into the modern day with putting some positive valve stem seals on it that actually do a lot better job of actually metering the oil that's allowed into the guide to allow proper lubrication without excessive lubrication. What that means is we have to cut the top of the guide down to accept this seal, and we also have to make sure that at full valve lift we have enough clearance between that valve stem seal and the bottom of our retainer. So we've done the math here and we figured out that we need to cut about 200 thousandths extra off of here to give us a comfortable number. I've set a stop on the spindle on this one here. This is the height that we want to cut all of them down to. The head is level, and that still leaves enough of the original guide there that our aftermarket spring that we've bought is going to be able to locate off of that little spot there. Our last step on the valve guides before we're ready to move on to seat work is to set our valve guide clearance. So what I've done is I do this a combination of using measuring tools as well as kind of by feel. We've measured the valve stems, and we know that we're going to come out at, or we'd like to come out on the intake at just over 2 thousandths clearance and just over 2.5 thousandths clearance on the exhaust. So I've got my gauge set up here, and right now measuring these, we're at just around 1 thousandths clearance. So I'm going to be going through and honing the guides using our diamond valve guide hone until we have the correct clearance, as well as checking with my Surdy pilot that I've chosen that I know is going to end up with the right clearance to make sure that it has a good fit so that we can do our machine work easily on the Surdy. I'm using a little bit of honing oil on this as well.
I never really realized what a dork I look like when I'm honing guides, so I'm definitely going to have to work on my form a little bit.
So with that, we've got our pilot fitting good, we've got our guides measuring good, and we'll be ready to move on to the Surdy to do the valve seat machining. Now I've got one of the heads up on the Surdy. We're going to be installing hard exhaust seats, so I've picked out our size here that we're going to be using, and I'm getting the cutting tools set up so that we can cut our seat counterbore to drive in our new seats. I also went ahead and put a pilot in here and put my level on. Right now I've got the dual axis rollover fixture mounted here on the Surdy that works pretty well for V8 heads, so I was able to get leveled up here and we can do our cutting. So I want the top of my seat to be even there with the casting of the combustion chamber. So what I've done is I've gone until my cutter just barely touches the top of the casting, and I've zeroed my DRO. And at that point we're going to set our stop so that we can cut to the exact depth that we want. This is basically a collar lock on the spindle that I can put my valve seat in here and we can set our stop. I'll lock it down here. And then this is one thing I really like about the Surdy. It has a little bit of a fine adjust here, so you can get just the right amount of tension on that. And with that set, I know that I can cut the exact dimension of this seat into the head so that we get it at just the right depth. And I can also watch the DRO as we do that to just kind of make sure that we're getting at the depth that I think we are. And there's kind of a look of what it looks like after we've got the counterbores cut. I'll go through and vacuum up the chips, and then we'll just kind of double check, make sure that we didn't hit any water jackets when we did that. Now to drive in our seats, we put a pilot in the valve guide, and then we have a driver that goes over that so that we can drive nice and square to the counterbore. So the top of my seats are sitting just a few thousandths above that flat surface of the combustion chamber. So I'm going to take one of my other cutters now and just take it down and just trim that top off so that they're nice and flush and everything looks good.
Some people may have different thoughts on this, but my personal preference is to cut the counterbore a little bit shallow, and then you can trim off the top as opposed to putting in the seats too deep.
I'm going to start by cutting the exhaust seats, and we've got a 3-angle cutting insert here, 45-degree seat, 60 thousandths of an inch wide, and I'm basically using this tool to check on the valve and kind of position it where I want that outer edge of our seat to be, and then I'll use that same tool to adjust our cutter to have that same dimension. That way we can cut the seats and have them come out where we want them to be. So like I was saying here, I've adjusted my cutter out and locked it down so that it, using that pointer, I know that the outer angle of my seat, or the outer edge of my seat, is going to be positioned on the valve where I would like it to be.
It was around this point that I came to the conclusion that the supposed stock replacement valves we had originally purchased were not going to come out to the specifications required. And as such, we opted to go with a set of 400 Pontiac valves from Engine Pro, which are actually a performance valve, and we modified them to suit our application. This is all covered in the previous video in this playlist, which I'll link in the description as well.
So the one unfortunate thing, since we originally thought we were using a different set of valves than we ended up using, I am going to have to go back and hone the exhaust guides a little bit and make them a little bit bigger to have the clearance that we want. And that's because the stem size on these intake and exhaust guides are exactly the same, but we want a little bit more clearance on the exhaust. Whereas on the original guides, or the original valves that we were using, the valve stem of the exhaust guide was a little bit smaller than the intake guide. So I was able to size them all the same and get the clearance I wanted. But now we're going to have to make the exhaust guides a little bit bigger. I don't know where we had gotten to on the valve job in the video before we decided to make our change on the valves, but I had kind of started to cut one of the seats, and now where I'm at is I've got our new valves that we modified in the previous video, and I went ahead and figured out where that seat that I had already cut is hitting the valve, and now we're going to figure out how much we need to extend it out to get it to seat correctly on this valve face, since it is a bigger valve.
Having installed exhaust seats, the first step was to open the ID of the seat to blend into the port as opposed to leaving a ledge there. It really moves fairly quick once you have your cutter set to the correct dimension, as you can move quickly from one seat to the next, making your cuts to the same depth using the spindle depth digital readout. With the seats blended well, I set my 3-angle cutting insert to the desired dimension to center the seat contact area well on the valve face. This positioning should promote efficient heat transfer between the valve and the seat, as well as good durability, as the exhaust valve and seat see significant temperatures inside a running engine. Now at this point in the video, I had already finished the seats on the other head, so as I'm cutting, I'm using this deck bridge to measure the depth of the seats relative to the head gasket surface. My goal is to get all of the seats to the same relative depth across both heads, so I use a combination of the DRO on the machine as well as the deck bridge to check the depth as I cut and hit the desired specification. The other thing that I always do as I'm cutting the seats on the Surdy is vacuum check each seat as I go so that I know right away whether or not a seat has a sealing issue, because it's easier to fix now than once the head is assembled. With no lube on the valve stems, there will be a slight vacuum leak in the valve guide clearance, but I know from experience this is more than acceptable.
Sucking so hard it's hurting my hand.
With the exhaust seats done, we level up the head again so that we can move on to the intake seats, which are going to be a little more complicated because we are increasing that valve diameter a pretty good amount. Big cuts like this can be kind of tough as they want to chatter, so it required some patience as we were removing this material, and again, this is just a rough starting point before getting to the point of forming our seat. We're using a 3-angle cutting insert again on the intake side, but at a 40 thousandths wide 30-degree seat angle as opposed to the 60 thousandths wide 45 that I put on the exhaust seats. In addition, we're going to push the seat contact area closer to the outer edge of the intake valve to take advantage of the full diameter of that valve. Again, here I'm working to get all of the seats cut to the same depth relative to the head gasket surface across both heads. With all of the seats cut, I came back with one more cutter just to blend that edge at the bottom of the port a little bit better, and we were pretty much finished with the intake seats. And just again as we go, we're going to vacuum check each one of those intake seats to make sure they're good, and a little bit of leak down here is fine because that's what's going between the valve stem and the valve guide in the valve guide clearance.
The issue you get into when you're working with these old heads, they might have been done over the years. We decided these maybe had one valve job over the years, and on top of that, they just have, you know, the 1960s technology. I mean, I don't want to call it technology, but, you know, machining practices, and some of it's just a little bit sloppy sometimes. So, like, for instance, you know, I can do all of my measuring off of the combustion chamber using a deck bridge checking against the height of the valve, and I can set all of my valves at the same height that way. But when you get to the opposite side, if all of these spring pockets are machined at a different length, then our spring installed heights are different. So it's just kind of those frustrating little things that you have to check and fudge because, you know, as remanufacturers, that's what we have to do. It's not always, you don't always have, you know, a perfect piece to start with. You have to make do with what you have. Over the weekend and this morning, I did a little bit more thinking on these heads, and I don't remember how much I talked about it, but like we discovered, these spring seats, which is the pad basically where the spring sits on the cylinder head, they're quite a bit off. I mean, up to almost 30 thousandths variation in these things. And I'd kind of like to put a hardened shim under every single spring just to make these last as well as possible. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking a measurement and kind of getting an average, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut the spring seat to be a little bit lower so that we can account for this, and then they're all going to be even and we're not going to have as much variation in our spring installed height.
Typically I would use one of our fixed spring seat cutters, but I don't have one that has the correct ID to locate the springs that we're using on these heads. So instead I used one of our valve seat cutters with a 90-degree insert adjusted to the correct ID. Doing it this way actually worked extremely well, and I'm actually glad that I thought of doing it this way because now I know to use this technique in the future if I have anything weird like this. It might sound crazy, but I'm actually using windshield wiper fluid here for my cutting fluid, and that actually helped a ton. It was a little chattery before, but once I put that on, everything cut fine. With all of our machining finished and final measurements checked, I got the heads thoroughly cleaned one more time and got everything laid out for assembly. So to get started here, we're installing all of the valves, and obviously as usual we're using a good assembly lube on the valve stems. Next I went ahead and installed our positive Viton valve stem seals, which did get installed on both the intake and the exhaust guides, followed by the hardened shims, which are chosen to get the installed spring height correct. And finally we install all of our valve springs, retainers, and keepers using the pneumatic valve spring compressor, which can be a really good way to pinch yourself if you're not careful. And again, we vacuum checked each of the valve seats while they were being cut on the Surdy, but it never hurts to go back and give it one more quality check just to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the assembly.
With that, our valve job's wrapped up on the 350 Pontiac heads. As we went through, you guys saw, we installed new valve guides. We got new valve stem seals that, we cut the head for positive valve stem seals, made sure there was enough clearance for our retainer at max cam lift so that we don't smash the seals. We've got Engine Pro springs here, comp cams, retainers, and keepers. Our Engine Pro valves that we did kind of customize in that previous video that you guys, if you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. And I put some stainless steel plugs in here, and got the intake surface was good, but the exhaust surface we did again, and the head gasket surface we did on both heads. So these came out really nice. Again, it's one of those things where you work with what you've got and you do the best that you can, and at the end of the day, these heads turned out really, really nice, and I can't wait to see what they look like on our finished engine. Again, I want to say a big thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.